We are continuing with Unit 7, Topic 7.3 in AP US History. So in this lecture, we're going to focus on this topic, 7.3, the Spanish-American War. We're going to touch very briefly on some of the war's battle, but our main focus will be on its effects and how it propelled the United States into becoming a global power. So by the end of this lecture, you're going to understand how the U.S. acquisition of territories like Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines shaped America's diplomatic, economic, and cultural relationships with the world. And I know the U.S. didn't completely acquire Cuba, but after this war, it got a great deal of control over it. So we're going to start by examining the background of the conflict. Okay, so here we are. So Cuba was one of Spain's last remaining colonies in the Western Hemisphere. So throughout the 19th century, particularly that would be like the 1810s, like the 1810s, the 1820s, Spain is going to lose most of its territories in the New World. And so Mexico is going to declare its independence. All throughout South America, different countries are going to become independent of Spain. And so basically countries in the Western Hemisphere, countries like, or I guess they weren't countries then, but colonies like Cuba and Puerto Rico are going to be some of the last remaining vestiges of the Spanish Empire in this part of the world. And these places have been under Spanish control since the 1500s. And so, so throughout the 19th century, though, there's going to be numerous Cuban uprisings against Spanish rule. So Spain's response was always very harsh, and they aimed to suppress any rebellion. So General Valeriano Butcher Weyler was sent to Cuba to crush resistance, and he established what were basically concentration camps of Cubans, and they died by starvation and disease. And so the United States had vested interest in Cuba. And remember, Cuba was only 90 miles from Florida. So Cuba, you can imagine this is Florida, this is Cuba, this is very close to the United States. American businesses had made also significant investments in sugar Cuban plantations. So also, instability in Cuba posed a potential threat to infrastructure projects like the Panama Canal. Somehow that, like the Panama Canal is down here, Cuba's here, somehow if the unrest spreads, it could pose a threat to that project the United States was looking to get going. So the plight of the Cuban people also resonated with the American public, and that's going to be fueled by sensationalist reporting known as yellow journalism. So yellow journalism, and that's going to be led by people like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, is going to exaggerate events to sell newspapers. However, in this instance, there wasn't much exaggeration concerning the concentration camps, because there really were concentration camps. There's people starving and dying. You can see some of these pictures of people, of what the Spanish were doing to the native Cuban people. Regardless, these are going to paint Spain as a villain, and this is going to stir American sympathy for the revolutionaries in Cuba. But the United States is not yet going to be ready to intervene in Cuba at this point. Okay, so the United States involvement escalated with the deployment of the USS Maine to Havana Harbor in January of 1898. So the ship was sent to protect American citizens and interests. However, on February 15th, 1898, the USS Maine exploded, killing over 250 soldiers. The cause of the explosion was debated. The U.S. claimed it was caused by a Spanish mine, while Spain insisted it was an internal accident. Modern evidence suggests an internal coal dust explosion was likely responsible. And remember, these steel naval vessels were new to the U.S., so there could have been some type of faulty engineering involved. American newspapers, though, seized on the tragedy, rallying public support for the war with the cry, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." President McKinley initially resisted calls for war, but eventually sought a declaration from Congress in April 1898. As part of the declaration, Congress passed something called the Teller Amendment. You want to remember that? And that's promising that the U.S. would not annex Cuba and that the island would remain independent. Now we come to the war itself. So the war spanned the Caribbean and the Pacific. In the Philippines, Commodore George Dewey decisively defeated the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay on May 1st, 1898, suffering minimal casualties. Meanwhile, in Cuba, Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders gained fame for their charge up San Juan Hill, aided by African American regiments. And before this time, Theodore Roosevelt, who we call Teddy Roosevelt, was the Secretary of the Navy, and he was largely responsible, or in some ways responsible, for the U.S. having this new all-steel Navy. And so when the war started, he actually quit his post as Secretary of the Navy and went in as a soldier and got this band of soldiers who he called the Rough Riders. And so people are going to look at him as a hero because of this. So at the same time, the U.S. also invaded Puerto Rico. And why? Because these three places, the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, are all going to be Spanish colonies. And so we're at war with Spain, encountering little resistance. By July 1898, the Spanish fleet had been destroyed and an armistice was signed in August. The war, often referred to as a Splendid Little War, lasted only 4 months and resulted in minimal American casualties compared to other conflicts. I think there was something like 500 U.S. combat casualties in this war. And a big thing is this is going to propel the U.S. into into a global spotlight. We now have a superior navy to a European power. And there's going to be some people who even say that we should go and attack Spain at this point, which of course was never seriously considered. Okay, so there's going to be an armistice that's signed on October 12th, 1898. It's going to be called the Treaty of Paris. And it's going to formally end the war. Spain is going to relinquish control of Cuba, which became independent under U.S. supervision. The U.S. acquired Guam and Puerto Rico as territories, but the fate of the Philippines is going to spark a really big debate. So you're going to have Emilio Aguinaldo. He's a Filipino leader who allied with the U.S. against Spain, and he expected independence from the Philippines, but the U.S. decided to retain control, and President McKinley is going to justify it by saying that the Philippines were not ready for self-governance. And so this is going to lead to the Philippine-American War, which is a really bloody conflict that's going to last until 1902, with thousands of casualties on both sides. So you can see here that it devolved into guerrilla warfare, and there's going to be some very nasty things that happen. There's actually going to be atrocities committed by both sides, and the U.S. is actually going to have some concentration camps very similar to what the Spanish did in Cuba. All right, so then we have China in the open door policy. So the Spanish-American War also set the stage for an increased U.S. involvement in Asia and China. Asia. So China, weakened by defeat in the Sino-Japanese War, is going to face encroachment by European powers, carving out spheres of influence. So if you can remember, Africa was carved up by European powers at the conference, at the Berlin Conference in the late 1800s, and they're going to look at China and they're going to kind of think that they're going to be able to do the same thing. And so the European powers, instead of colonizing China, you can think of it as like pre-colonization, and they have spheres of influence where maybe like China or Japan or Russia or Great Britain will each have their own territory where they have exclusive rights to do trade and to get resources from China. And at this time, there's about 300 million people living in China, so it's a huge market for goods. Okay, and Secretary of State John Hay of the United States is going to issue the Open Door Notes, advocating equal trade access for all nations and preserving China's territorial integrity. The European powers and the other powers who already have their spheres of influence in China, and remember the United States does not, are going to kind of laugh at this. However, something's going to happen that's going to change their mind. It's going to be the Boxer Rebellion, and that's going to erupt as Chinese nationalists want to expel this foreign influence. So they're tired of all these foreign products, foreign religions like Christianity, and these missionaries coming in, and foreign culture, and they're going to fight against the foreigners. And so it's going to be called the Boxer Rebellion, and really what it's something like the Society of the Harmonious Fist is what it's called, the group that attacks the foreigners, and they're martial artists. And so the reason why it's called the Boxer Rebellion is because boxing is really the only martial art that Westerners really know. And so instead of calling it like the Kung Fu Rebellion or whatever it was, they call it the Boxer Rebellion. And so now that the United States is, and they're going to attack, there's going to be like a foreign legation, I think, in Shanghai. And it's just like this walled compound where foreigners live there, and the Boxers are going to surround it. And eventually there's going to be a multinational force that includes about 2,600 Americans. It might be more. But the point is that we had Americans stationed in the Philippines at this point. So we took our troops from the Philippines, brought them to China. We helped with a group of other people to quell the Boxer Rebellion. And so we're victorious. And the idea is that now the rest of the countries see that having these spheres of influence is not a good idea. That as long as they're doing this pre-colonial type activity, trying to do this colonial activity, it's going to cost them way too much. And so they kind of back off, and they support the open door policy. And so now China has been opened to the United States.